afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to get started because time is precious this afternoon. I think we only have 75 minutes. My name is Catharine Rice, and I'm one of your NATOA board members who will be leaving the board this year. I'm also the project director for the Coalition for Local Internet Choice and the president of the VTOA chapter, which is the Virginia chapter. Our session today is called Broadband and Economic Development, or Broadband Connectivity and Economic Development, and the question is there a connection? I draw your eyes to the slide on the screen. I think this is some amazing information, which for some reason I just hadn't put together myself. The world's largest taxi company owns no vehicles. It's called Uber. The world's most popular media owner creates no content. It's called Facebook. The most valuable retailer has no inventory. It's called Alibaba. And the world's largest accommodation provider owns no real estate. It's called Airbnb. Folks, something incredible is going on, and I think there's a connection between broadband and economic development. So today we have 4 fine panelists whose brains we're going to tap. They will start out by providing us a little background information, and then I really hope to open it up to you guys, because I think in my personal experience, it's the questions from the audience that make these workshops so much fun and so valuable. I'm not going to go in depth on their bios, but in order of seating. We have Heather Burnett-Gold, who you all know probably. She is the president and CEO of the Fiber to the Home Council. And Heather is going to talk about the economic impact of fiber to the home and some research they've been doing. Sitting next to Heather is Lori Sherwood. Lori is the Director of Broadband Development for Vantage. Lori is going to talk a little bit about SNG's 50-state survey, showing the link between broadband and economic development, and then she's going to get into the trenches a bit and give us some insights on a case study from a rural area called Brainerd, Minnesota, if I'm saying that correctly. Brainerd? Okay. On the impact of broadband has had on a rural community. To Lori's left is Doug Adams. Doug is CMO. Doug, what is CMO? Chief Marketing Officer of the Think Agency from Boulder, Colorado. And Doug is going to talk about maximizing your network value with marketing principles, some marketing principles. How do you sell this critical infrastructure to your community? And to Doug's left, we have John Burchett, who is the Director of Public Policy for the United States, for Latin America, and Canada for Google. And so John is going to kind of be the cleanup act. He is going to talk about what cities can do to prepare themselves to be fiber communities. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Heather. Take it away, Heather.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real privilege to be here, and I just want to thank all of the NATOA, I can't even talk yet, NATOA folks, and particularly Steve Traylor, who has always been a delight to work with and a good partner, and to the Fiber to the Home community anyway. So with that, I want to talk about the work we do on looking at the economic impact of fiber to the home and some of the differences that might make to your communities. I'm hoping. So each year we sponsor 2 main studies that look at the impact of FTTH. We have a consumer survey, which usually comes out in time for our June annual meeting, and that looks at things like how reliable consumers rate services, cost of what you get versus which the customer perceives as more value added, and what kind of value they think they're getting. We look at trends in work from home and telework. And then we do the annual market survey, which involves providers, and that one comes out at the end of the year, and that's the kind of one that we in the press get excited about, because it tells you how many more million homes are passed and versus connected. And what we have this year is approximately 26 million homes passed in the U.S., and about 13.5 of those million are connected, and that means that the take rate for FTTH is about 50%, which is pretty good. And I know those of you from rural areas often have far higher than that. So those are done every year. And then we do topical studies, and those are the ones I'm going to speak to this afternoon. The first one we did was an impact of gigabit broadband on GDP in certain areas, and I'll go into that. And then we looked at the impact of high-speed internet service on housing prices. And then last but not least, we just concluded a study of the impact of fiber on MDU pricing. So, good. Okay. When we looked at the impact of gigabit connectivity on GDP pricing, we looked at, we used the NTIA data, the broadband study data, and we looked at MSAs in which greater than 50% were passed by gigabit broadband between 2011 and 2012. This covered 14 MSAs in 9 states, and on average, they had 70% of them had access to gigabit broadband in 2012. We then compared the same group to 41 similarly sized MSAs in the same 9 states. So we were looking for apples versus apples in terms of community, but these did not have gigabit broadband available. All the MSAs reviewed had populations of less than 1 million, so they were not large metropolitan areas. And then we did a regression model to control for other factors that might have impacted GDP. So what we found is that GDP levels in MSAs where gigabit broadband service was introduced in that time period was significantly higher. We found that per capita GDP increased was approximately 1.1% higher than in the MSAs with minimal availability. The 14 communities we resourced had an additional 1.4 billion in GDP in 2012. And using that impact, we found that in the other 41 communities, it was a foregone GDP of about 3.3 billion. So in other words, gigabit access really did drive up the economic value of the community. The next study we undertook was the impact of fiber access on home prices. And we don't do these in-house. I just want to assure you that they're done by people that know what they're doing. So we examined the relationship between the availability of fiber and prices of homes in the U.S. only. And the random sample included 1.2 million real estate transactions, again, in the 2011 to 13 period. And that was because that's when the data was available from Realty Track, which is somebody that collects this kind of home sale data. It also corresponds with the availability of data from the National Broadband Map, and that supposedly tells us where fiber access is available by census block groups. We all know there's some issues with that data, but it's the best we have. We omitted all non-single family homes or all non-ARMS transactions, such as parents selling to children or that kind of situation. And then the final data set still had over 500,000 transactions. It covered all 50 states and the District of Columbia. And the average sale price was $234,000 and the median was $175,000, which is close to the national average. So we felt pretty good about this. Then we looked at using the FCC definition of broadband, which at that time was a minimum of download speeds of 25 megabits per minute. Then we broke them into tiers. So we had 25, 50, 100, and 1 gigabit. And you can see that the sample was pretty well distributed among those breakdowns. So we felt that it was a pretty good statistical example. And here are the results. So if you had access to a gigabit you would pay more for your home price, or it would increase the price of your home by 1.8% of the price. Just access to fiber alone increased the price 1.3%. So if you lived in a community where you had gigabit access through fiber to the home, it went up 3.1%. And that's a pretty good story for a lot of people who have gigabit access. And that is the equivalent to adding a fireplace or half a bathroom. Now, I don't know which half of the bathroom you add, but it's still, you know, it's $5,400 on a medium housing price. And the thing that was fun about this is this was a in-depth statistical study done by 3 economists out of the University of Colorado. It totally tracked with what Mike Render finds every year in his consumer survey, which is more of a survey rather than a statistical analysis. And what he has found is that people will pay up to, I think it's $4,000 more for a house if it has fiber to the home. But, and he differentiates this, if you've ever had fiber to the home, you'll pay $6,500 more. So in other words, once you had it, you value it even more than if you've never had it, but you think it might be cool. And then last but not least, this year, we wanted to do the same kind of analysis of the impact of fiber to the home on the MDU market. And this one we did via survey, and we interviewed over 2,000 MDU residents in both Canada and the US. And of course, we found that MDU dwellers spend more time online and using online streaming video than comparably aged single-family dwellers. And that it is now, broadband itself is the #1 amenity desired by all MDU residents. It is beyond, you know, the pool or anything. And residents of fiber to the unit, which is where an MDU has actually run fiber from the basement up to the individual unit, they report better, their consumer perception is that they have better performance and speed than any other broadband technology available to them. And what happens if you're more satisfied with your unit? You stay longer. It reduces the churn. So the results of this study were that purchasers were willing to pay 2.8% more for a high-speed fiber connection, and that's on an average price of $300,000. So that tracks pretty closely to what we found with single-family homes. And renters are willing to pay 8% more, $80 a month more on an average of $1,000 in rent to have a fiber connection. And that $80 comes from a combination of extending their lease and willingness to pay more. So it's a study that showed good things for both people that own, people that rent, and owners.
Thank you, Heather. And Steve Trailer, I see you're in the front of the room. Are we going to make the PowerPoints available on the NATO website after the conference? Everything's available. Okay, because this is good data that you folks should take back home with you. I know in my community we found it really, really helpful to talk to real estate groups and also the Chamber of Commerce about these increased values. It'll help you a lot in persuading your local elected officials this is an important investment. And now we have Lori Sherwood.
Hello, everyone. Sorry about that. I'm technically challenged. Okay, here we go. So good afternoon. This afternoon, I am talking to you about 2 studies that I had the privilege of working on. The first one was a study that, along with Monica Babine of Washington State University, Maria Alvarez-Stroud of University of Wisconsin, we worked with S&G, who spearheaded this initiative, as well as the Rural Telecom Council, in assessing what was going on with broadband in the states. And Doug was actually the main architect of the survey, which S&G issued out to all 50 states and received back 48 of 50 completed surveys in a very short period of time. As you can see, 2 states declined to participate. And the purpose of the survey was to really figure out what was going on in 5 main areas: availability, adoption, meaningful use, investment, and regulation. And the criteria was, we looked at the survey results, analyzed the criteria, and came up with rankings in 4 of these categories, as well as an overall ranking of where the states are with broadband. And as you can see, if you want to download the full report, there's the URL for that. So here's what the overall ranking, how it came out. The top 5 are New York, Ohio, Maine, New Mexico, and New Hampshire. And this was based off of all the data we received back in all of those categories. As you can see, one other note that we put on there was that the asterisks indicate those states that have a state broadband office. So the key takeaways from this were that 19 of 20 states in the top 20 have a state broadband office. This is significant. Clearly, the states that chose to have a broadband office were performing better and deploying broadband to their residents than states that did not. 16 of the bottom 20 do not have a state broadband office. And as you can see, if you look at the different verticals: investment, meaningful use, adoption, and availability, 10 of 10 in investment had a broadband office. Presumably, they're funding themselves as well. So the key takeaways here are funding. 28% of states have funding allocated to broadband initiatives, and that really factors in greatly in the overall rankings. So really, what does this mean in terms of economic development? Well, we're not going to talk to you today about growth investment. We could go on about what states need to do in terms of creating growth investment in broadband, but this is what states reported back to us as what they felt they needed. More private investment in broadband infrastructure, 87% felt that. More training and education for citizens, public investment in broadband infrastructure, more training and education for businesses, regulatory and/or legislative changes to encourage more broadband investment, and then at the bottom, evaluation of social and economic benefits to support investment. But even that was 50%. So you can see that there's recognition among the states that there's a lot of needs, and not all of these needs can be provided by state government. There's a lot of partners that are going to need to enter into this arena: nonprofits, organizations, associations, and others to help with broadband in the states. So I'm going through this data fast, but because we want to get through to some other things. But as you can see, really, what this boils down to on an economic level and a local level, and I'll share with you a rural Minnesota broadband impact study that we did on behalf of a client. Consolidated Telephone Company in Brainerd, Minnesota, received a 2015 border-to-border grant and wanted to measure what the economic impact was on those residents that received broadband in these 2 communities. So we surveyed 468 customers and got 28% back of customer responses. So what this meant on a local economic impact is that economic development does not necessarily mean bricks and mortar. We're talking about businesses. You think about business locations, locating big businesses in your community. That is economic development, but as well, it also means that people need the internet to work where they live. So the internet plays a critical role, that more than half using their home internet for work, and 14% reporting that they telework. 1 in 5 said they have a home-based business or farm. And 36% reported that the internet reduced their overall operating costs. So in a meaningful way, an internet connection to the home for people who can now stay at home, work from home, and have home-based businesses, we asked them to give us some feedback on how does it impact you? And here's what they told us. It enables getting work done faster, saves time on supply orders, helps getting back to customers quickly, less travel, conducting meetings online, enables website capabilities, and enables us to access educational tools online, which helps us in our business. So there's a significant impact here on the daily life of what folks can do at home. And some of the things that they are doing with their internet connection for home-based businesses are managing websites, processing orders, farm automation, utilizing online educational tools. And you can imagine what other activities there are, but this is a significant amount of activity going on. So one of the question's key findings was that 9% have plans to start a home-based business in the next 1 to 3 years. Now, this is a rural community in Minnesota, and you can imagine what this means. These individuals now have the ability to start a business where they work. They don't have to move. The jobs stay in the community. The income stays in the community. The property values stay elevated, as Heather just talked about. So really the final takeaway on this is that when you're thinking about economic impact, it's not just about big business. It's about small business. It's about the economic lifestyles of your residents who work from home, who need these connections. And so when you're talking to your communities about need, really you can bring it down to the grassroots level and talk about those elements. And aside from the PowerPoint, I'd be happy to share with anyone the study that we did, which is also published on the Blandin Foundation's website. So, thank you.
Great data, Lori. Thank you. Great data. All right, Doug, take it away. You're going to teach us all how to market this stuff, right?
I'm going to try. Okay, about 6 years ago, I started my own business, Think Agency. One of my first clients was Strategic Networks Group. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to be sharing a lot of the findings of SNG, as well as my own background within marketing. This first slide is, and I think it's important to say, where do we stand right now as far as businesses are concerned, since this presentation is supposed to be about economic development, right? Okay, good. I'm in the right place. So where do we stand right now today? S&G has surveyed tens of thousands of businesses. Most recent data says that the average download speed that a business has right now is 27 megs and 12 up. Not great, not terrible. Again, that's average. So let's talk about broadband from the perspective of, I want to select not where I live, but where I put my business. How important is that for me? Businesses since 2004 have said, it's important or essential on an astounding level. Only 11% say that it's not important. So I'm not even sure what those 11% of people are doing. But how important is it for someone to stay in a location? Again, essential is 56%, important is 28%. So you have to have decent broadband to keep people, either attract people or keep them in that location as far as their businesses are concerned. All this research is business-based data as opposed to household data. I wanted to look at through the database, and about 10,000 people, we asked what type of connection do you have, and then correspond it to how much they do online. Basically you would think that if someone has fiber, they would be doing a lot more than someone with DSL. As it turns out, that's not necessarily the case. It's not the case at all. The yellow bar, which is a little hard to see, which goes from 5.95 at the bottom, which is satellite, to 7.23 at the top, is a score of 0 to 10 that S&G, I'm not going to explain it, I don't have time. 10 is good, 0 is bad. Fiber is not that, as far as utilization of businesses, as far as what they're doing online, we're not as far as we think we are. Why is this? Who's seen this either from me or anybody, or in a marketing class, Marketing 101? This curve, the life cycle, technology life cycle adoptions. Does anybody have a iPhone 7 in the room? If you do, could you raise your hand? So there we have an early adopter. And by the way, if you have a Galaxy 7, could you please turn it off? So, anybody, so basically this is a theory that says there's about 15% of the population that no matter what technology it is, they'll adopt it because it is shiny and it is cool and it is new. So a lot of networks find that when they roll out fiber, the number of businesses that adopt right away, strangely is around that 15% mark. We're not getting people to cross that chasm at all. Why are we not? if you ever took a Marketing 101 class, people buy benefits. They don't buy features. What do we as an industry market? Speed. Is that a benefit? No, it's not. We can be lazy. We can be, because households have kids who want their Netflix so they can watch Friends while they're playing Call of Duty, while they're watching YouTube. And my kid says, I need better broadband. Large businesses have IT departments. This is what we need to do. We need to be on the cloud. Everything needs to be on the cloud, and we need to back it up every 10 minutes. Okay. 90% of our businesses don't know what the hell they need to do online. 90%. Those are small businesses. But are we changing the message to those small businesses? Speed. That's a feature. So how do we sell broadband? We need to talk about the benefits of broadband. What does speed mean? Do we need training? Do we need to train our businesses? You have to answer that question in your own community. And what are the economic advantages for a community to drive broadband training? Experience that we've seen from surveying businesses, and by we, in this case, it's SNG, businesses don't universally understand what they should be doing online. They don't have time. They're stretched thin. They don't have the staff. They need help. And it's, and us saying it's a utility doesn't make it so that everyone's going to use it. Everyone needs to take a shower or wash their clothes. Water's a utility. Broadband is a technology. Here it is in numbers. The smaller a business is, and again, we're going through that 0 to 10 score, the smaller a business is, the less they use the internet. Remember, 90% of businesses are less than 20 people in America. What's holding businesses back? I touched on this a little bit. There's just time and effort. There's too much information. They're overloaded. They have higher priorities, lack of internal resources. This will all be on the website later. For businesses who use the internet, the higher percentage of their revenues are, not surprisingly, attributed to the internet. Using the internet for businesses means growth, means revenue. Specifically for an individual business, if they just increase their utilization by 10%, they increase their revenues by 24%, and they decrease their costs by 7%. This means as a region, if we want to actually push the economic advantages of broadband, we need to help businesses use the internet. Real quick, I don't think I have time to go through this slide better, but if your one takeaway from here is Marketing 101, a feature is speed, and we need to talk about the benefits of broadband, especially to businesses. So I went through and I was looking for some examples, and one of them is a bit self-serving. SNG has a program called the Small Business Growth Program that basically a business will take a survey and then get a scorecard kicked out, and it'll say businesses your size in your industry are doing this that you're not doing. Here's what you should be doing. Kansas City has used this program. There's many communities that have used this program with some success. I know we all like to put Chattanooga up on a pedestal, but they kind of stink at marketing. They're not doing anything, and it shows in utilization numbers. Their utilization in Chattanooga among small businesses is only 2% higher than the rest than businesses in the rest of the state. And that is from this year. We surveyed Tennessee, all of Tennessee earlier this year. Use your community leaders. Use the community leaders to rally the troops. Get people to understand what's going on. Understand why broadband is important for businesses and the benefits. I'm going to show a quick video. This is one approach that I think is pretty cool. Longmont, which is next to Boulder, and perhaps Boulder's redheaded stepsister, has done a fantastic job. Redheaded stepsister, maybe? Yeah. They've done a fantastic job with their fiber network over the past few years, and they have a video where they're talking about they're basically waving the flag here. I don't know if it's going to work.
Lines. They mark our achievements and measure our growth. They guide us safely ahead. Lines are what give us shape, form, and definition. They connect the dots and even the stars. Truth is, we depend on lines. And in Longmont, we like to draw our own. It's part of our independent spirit. It's in our history and our heritage. We don't wait for progress to happen. We make it ourselves. We talk about it, we vote on it, and we get it done. Over 100 years ago, we built lines to carry our power, to light our community. Now, our light and our lines have come full circle. We've built new lines to light our future and fill the next chapter of our history. These are the lines of NextLight, Longmont's community-owned and operated broadband internet and phone service. A 100% fiber optic network with speeds and performance among the fastest in the world. A parallel universe where you can reach across space and time at the speed of light. Connect and stay connected, because the only lines that matter are the ones we draw ourselves. NextLight.
So you notice they did talk about speed, but they showed some actual applications. They also, draped themselves in the Longmont community flag, and basically it's your civic duty to connect. That's pretty good marketing. I mean, I'm not going to move there, but it's pretty good marketing. Make sure you show businesses. Get some spokespeople. Get those influencers out there. This is I forget what town this was in, but I came across this. They're telling stories about how businesses are specifically using broadband and their new high-speed connection. Make sure you leverage that. So what should you do? I mean, other than go out to dinner tonight. So what you should, as far as your network, if you were looking to actually drive economic impact, which is why we're building the networks in the first place, right? Or do we just want to get friends on our kids' computers faster, the show? No, we want to drive economic impact. You need to help businesses understand the benefits. Speed is not a benefit. You need to provide information and tools, training, opportunities for them to come to some sort of facility, incubator, some way to show them, help them develop a business case and a plan to actually use the internet. And remember, Chattanooga, 2% higher than the rest of the state in utilization. And market benefits. And that is my presentation.
John Burchett.
Good afternoon, folks. My name's John Burchett, and I run the public policy operation at Google Fiber. An update from my title, the long, elaborate title on the Google side. I moved over to fiber about 8-9 months ago. So I'm here to talk about, we've heard a lot of reasons and a lot of thinking about why broadband and fiber speed and fiber to the home makes such an impact for your communities and people in your communities from an economic development standpoint. What I want to talk about is, okay, what do you do now? How do you get you and your city ready in order to be ready for fiber to come, not just from Google Fiber, but from any provider that's out there looking to deploy and invest in your community. 3 general categories. One, if you haven't already, organized your infrastructure information so that when somebody comes in to explore whether or not bringing broadband or fiber to your community makes sense, that you have it in a coherent way, in a way that's accessible. Secondly, and I'll go into some details on some of these, secondly, make it easy for providers to share existing infrastructure. For folks, for a lot of the incumbents, and even in the franchise discussion today, for some of the incumbents that are now into cable or into video, but already are on poles and do have infrastructure and a footprint, it's a very different dynamic than if you want a totally new provider with no footprint in your community to come in. So sharing existing infrastructure is really a huge issue for Google Fiber and I think for the new entrants in general. And then help makes construction speedy and predictable. We've found the unpredictability of being able to plan how we are going to be able to build in the community has been a huge source of challenge for us. So this is a whole area, and we'll go into that in a little bit too. Okay, and I'm going to hit on each one of these briefly, and then I'd be happy to go into any amount of detail with anybody as we go. One-touch make-ready, dig smart, micro-trenching, franchising, MDUs, and your locates regime. These are the policy areas that we've found that if communities get these right, it's going to make things a lot easier and a lot more attractive to new entrants. So, traditional make-ready work. Okay, so there's a couple phases of this, and this is mostly on poles. There's a right to attach to a pole, and a new entrant has to get from either utility or AT&T or whoever owns the poles and a right to attach. And everyone thinks, okay, you've got a right to attach, you have a pole attachment agreement, you're done. But the real challenge, what we found, is what's called make-ready work. So on this slide, up top is 3 lines, and let's say those are all power related. Then there's a grouping of communications. Those by rule, and the rules differ in different places, have to be a certain distance away from each other, and they have to be in a certain order. So if a new entrant comes in and wants to get on these poles, the current existing incumbents often need to move their stuff. And that usually means taking a bracket out, moving it down 3 inches, and putting a bracket in. But the current way the system works is the new entrant has to go to each current attacher, do an application. That attacher has 60 days to respond, and human nature and in economic incentive, they aren't necessarily looking for a new entrant in the market. They use all 60 days. They then they move their thing 3 inches down. Then the new entrant has to go to the second attacher and do the same thing. And then the third attacher and do the same thing. For example, we have been in Nashville, Tennessee, Google Fiber has been under construction for 11 months, and we are on 33 poles out of 90,000 in Nashville that we need to get onto. So, Fiber to the Home Council, Google Fiber, a few other folks out there thinking about this have come up with a concept called one-touch make-ready. Excuse me, should I turn that off? And essentially, one-touch make-ready says you give notice to all the folks, and if the owner of the pole wants to do all the moves themselves, great, within a certain 30-day period or whatever. But essentially, the premise is you go to the owner of the pole, and the owner of the pole gives you a list of approved contractors. And then using one of the approved contractors, the new entrant goes and makes all the moves at one time. It's wildly more efficient. It saves an incredible amount of time on deployment, and for time is money, obviously, for deployment purposes, and for your citizens who want this. It's safer because you only have one set of people climbing poles, and it eliminates 3 times that somebody's tromping through your backyard or closing off a street when they're working on the street. So this has been passed in Louisville, Kentucky. San Antonio is doing a similar concept through their municipal utility. And you may have heard there's been a little bit of a controversy in Nashville. And Nashville's voting in a couple hours, their 3rd vote, to see if the first 2 votes, Nashville's been interested in adopting it too. The incumbents hate it, let's be really clear. Under the category of don't touch my stuff is sort of the basic, rationale. And then, there's some AT&T has union contracts that they're nervous that this impacts union contracts. And I don't say this as a critique of them, but fundamentally the existing system allows the incumbents to be a gatekeeper to determine how long and how hard it is for a new entrant to come into the marketplace. And this has been a huge issue for Google Fiber. And if Google Fiber struggles with it, frankly, with the deep pockets that we've got, how in the heck is any, smaller entrant ever going to do it? So that's one touch make ready, and you probably will be hearing a lot more about that in the next 6 months to a year. Next whole issue, Dig Smart. You've heard of Dig Once, you've heard of Climb Once, and Dig Smart is the next iteration on that. And essentially, it's not just saying, when you open up a street, let everyone know, and anyone who's ready to hop in the street, we should all be laying our conduit at the same time, or laying whatever we need to lay. That makes perfect sense unless you're a new entrant and the street was opened up last year and you aren't there. So the Dig Smart concept is, whenever a city's opening up its streets or building new roads, they should be laying conduit as well. It adds about $10,000 a mile, so it's not insignificant in the additional cost, but it allows the city to have a revenue stream going forward, because then they lease out that conduit when a new entrant like us or like anybody else coming down the pike wants to use that conduit. It makes a ton of sense. It saves in long term on road construction, it saves on the hassle, it saves on the construction, and it allows a new entrant to come into your community much faster, and you get a revenue stream out of it. So that's Dig Smart. Micro-trenching. We're working hard on this. There's a couple other, or number of other entities out there working on it. Micro-trenching is essentially, it's the picture on the left. It's a saw that goes down, it lays the cable, it's about this wide, it goes down no more than like 18 inches deep. And then the machine follows up and fills it simultaneously. Way less disruption, from traffic disruption, way less expensive, way faster, and it's good enough of a grade within like an hour or two that a bicyclist is not going to have a problem. It's that small, and ultimately, we think it works really well in almost all settings. I was talking to our folks in Austin last night, and one problem we're having right in downtown, and the mayor alluded to it today, is it sort of messes with these sensors that they've got to measure traffic so that the lights turn. So you got to be careful and thoughtful and smart about it, but departments of public works often instinctively are like, we don't do it that way. Once you get past that initial stage and you start going into the science of it and the practicality of it, the people who've done it have found it really much less disruptive and much a big improvement. And the underlying theme of this is, if you're going to get new entrants in real competition in broadband and get it out to everybody, it's just got to be cheaper for the new folks coming in, and frankly for the incumbents too. We've got to figure out through technology and public policy changes how to make this less expensive and less time consuming so that it's not as big of a barrier into entry. Franchising. We talked about it this morning. That was a really interesting conversation. Predictability. The idea that the folks who are up here talking, the idea of a massive long-term negotiation with a city that takes 6-7 months with every city, that sounds perfectly reasonable on one level, but if you're looking at a company like ours who's figuring out how to do this nationally, the amount of lawyering up we would have to do do that in every community, it just doesn't scale. So figuring out if there's model franchising, if there's ways to do it, I totally get, I worked in local government at one point in my career. I've worked in state government. You guys got to protect the interests of your city and your interests of your community. But, if it ends up being an epic battle over everything to get things just the way you want it, frankly, the company's going to go elsewhere. It just is. And that's not a threat, that's not bullying. But if a company like Google's deciding what are the first 10, 15 cities we're going to spend the next 5 years building and investing in, it isn't going to be a city that has really, really burdensome franchising requirements. It just isn't, and that's, that's unfortunate, but it's the reality. MDUs. The FCC banned exclusive sales deals between landlords and service providers, but there still are exclusive marketing agreements. There's all sorts of ways, and inside wiring things. There's sale leaseback of who owns the inside wiring that are real huge barriers to a new entrant getting a foothold in the marketplace. So San Francisco's introducing an ordinance in the next couple of days to try to address it. Some states have laws against, excessive MDU deals by incumbents, but it is something for you guys to be aware of, especially if you're in a community that has a lot of MDUs. Finally, the locates regime. Before I got involved with Google Fiber, I had no idea what a locates regime was. And I didn't fully appreciate the massive ecosystem built around figuring out when we go to dig in somebody's front yard, how do we determine what's already there? This is a huge public safety issue, hitting a gas main, hitting water mains. It's a massive pain in the rear for the people in your community. It's a huge cost for the provider, and it creates a whole bunch of tension around construction. So what essentially the problem here is the regime was built for really small construction projects. And it was built on the idea that you want to encourage and incentivize everyone who's digging to call. So if you're digging in your front yard, you're going to plant a tree. You don't pay to have the utility company or the companies come out and say, mark the pipes and stuff so you don't rupture something. They pay. And that's to encourage you to do that because, it's too dangerous if we disincentivize that. But when a massive project comes in, like a citywide construction project, a multi-billion-dollar construction project, the locates regime often gets overwhelmed. It gets overwhelmed in that there aren't enough qualified workers to do all the locations. And we also have discovered, too, through this process of trial and error, a lot of stuff just isn't marked very well in the first place. So if you have older infrastructure, I have very dear friends who just renovated a house and were adding a little porch off the side. They dug in, and on their property they found a 4-foot wide drainage pipe, a city-owned drainage pipe that never made the transition on the paper from the papers in the 70s to electronic now, and they're just screwed because it's there. So, anything you can do as you're hearing and thinking about upgrading your database on your infrastructure, that's hugely helpful. But we've got to figure out the locate regime. I don't have a great answer on this one. The system needs more money. The system needs more capacity for high impact builds, but that's something the folks who are, the new entrants and the existing utilities and all the folks who are already in the ground need to figure out. And for us, for Google Fiber, we've got to think of it on both ways. Yes, we want to have a reasonable, quick, relatively cost-effective build, but as soon as we construct, we're going to be the ones in the ground too, and we're going to have to comply with the system too. So while obviously you got to take everything I say with a grain of salt because I've got some self-interest, on almost everything I'm talking about, we're going to be on the other side in 6 months in a different community. So we really are trying to be thoughtful about building a system that works for everyone, both the incumbents and the new entrants. So that's it. I'm happy to take any questions when the time comes. Thanks.
And the time is here. Okay, you guys, I know you came to this workshop because you had questions in your head and you wanted to ask them. So I throw it out to you. Who's got a question for this great panel? You came here to learn something. You couldn't have learned it all just now. And if you might, maybe I'll go grab the microphone. Mitzi, I'll go grab the microphone too.
Thanks read that far. So, is the mic on? So, to fiber to the home council. First is the in the group that you considered of the gigabit homes, was that only in the U.S.?
Yes.
Okay, and so is that limited to places that have Google Fiber or something like a Chattanooga?
It would have been communities that had gigabit access at that time period, 2011 to 2012. So I don't think Google Fiber would have been in that group.
So
But-
was that a relatively small sample set?
It was 9 communities it was 14 communities in 9 states.
Okay, all right.
So keep in mind that people started building fiber to the home and gigabit long before, thank goodness for us, Google made it more publicly noticeable. Many communities were building it quietly.
So can I just ask the people in the room, who has a gigabit to the home?
It's gigabit access, so you may not have picked a gigabit to the home, but it would have been available.
So does that mean to a business, or does that mean to, I'm
It's-
asking because
it-
it was looking specifically at housing. So
No, no,
I'm-
no. Oh, are you asking about the gigabit impact on GDP?
Yeah, so when you looked
Or are we
at
asking
how having access to a gigabit increases the value of your home, I'm just trying to get
Oh,
a
that's
sense of.
okay, that's a different study. So I was
Okay.
talking about 2 studies. Let me
Okay.
just break it out. The first one had to do with gigabit access available in the community. The second study was gigabit access to a home, and it was a little later period. So there might have been, and it was 13.9%, I believe, of the sample of 520,000 single-family homes.
Gotcha, okay, all right, thank you.
So
Thank
does
you.
that help?
Yes, thank you, okay. Lastly, on the fiber and the Dig Once policies. So a couple things there. One, does Tennessee, do they regulate their own pole attachment rates?
I can never remember, I apologize, I can't remember if Tennessee's a reverse preemption state or not. I don't believe they are. I think they are not a reverse preemption state, so I think they are governed by the FCC.
Okay, so in communities that are governed by FCC rules,
Right.
those rules in the 2011 order
Yep.
state that the applicant comes in and requests the utility the pole owner to do the make-ready work. There are 60 days in which the work has to be done. There's a 15-day grace period in certain circumstances. Some point in there, if the work isn't done, the utility can tell the third-party attacher
Yep.
that either you do it or we're going to do it for you
Right.
at your expense. And at that point, the person who's requesting the make-ready work has the right to use an approved contractor to do the work for that attacher.
Right.
So my question is, in that statistics that you rolled out there, are you finding that the people just aren't following the FCC rules?
I'm not sure 100% so. I don't believe, first of all, we believe that the FCC rules are a floor, they're not a ceiling, and that municipalities have the legal authority to have stricter rules or better rules. So that is the baseline, and I think the FCC largely agrees with us. They haven't said so publicly yet, but I think they do. The second, the piece I don't know for sure is whether the FCC's rules are sequential or all at once. The problem is when you have multiple attachers on the pole. Do you go through this process for the first attacher, who then moves it 3 inches down, that makes room, and then the person above them still needs to move 3 inches up? I think the FCC is also sequential, or is in action treated as sequential, and then you've got the same problem. If there's only one current telecommunication provider on the pole, it's a 60-day problem. If there's several, it's a 60-day unless somebody just sort of says, on day 59, can you give me 10 more days, and blah, 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 which happens all the time.
So have you filed with the FCC requesting those changes or an interpretation of them? And the reason I ask this, because it was my understanding, there are other pole attachment experts, that in states where you have not implemented your own pole attachment rules, the FCC governs and you're largely preempted.
We don't believe at all that you're preempted, and that's part of the lawsuit in Louisville. Louisville is FCC, a state that controls their own polls. Kentucky is. In that one, the issue probably won't come up because the FCC rules don't apply because the state has rules. In Tennessee, we believe that if we win in the ordinance and AT&T sues, which they're claiming to sue the next day, we certainly are pretty comfortable legally that the courts and the FCC will agree with us that you are not preempted from doing additional rules at the local level.
Okay, well, then I would just say to NATOA that it would be useful to maybe have an e-NATOA specifically addressing this question of, because I think there's like 34 states in which they're still governed by FCC rules. Do localities have the authority at the federal level to enact their own ordinances if you're in essentially an FCC state?
And to be fair, AT&T will tell you absolutely they don't. We'll say we believe they do.
We've got two follow-up.
This is Gabriel Garcia from San Antonio. Just to do a clarification, the question you asked or issue you raised, municipally owned utilities and co-ops are not subject to the FCC regulations. So while what Mitzi said about FCC regulations applying to investor-owned utilities is true, unless the state has developed a regime for pole regulation, they have to follow FCC rules. That is not true for municipally owned utilities and electric co-ops on their poles.
And therefore, you probably won't get an answer out of the Nashville if there's litigation there because Nashville is a municipally owned utility too.
So just to follow up on that, Ken Fellman from Denver, Colorado. In a number of states, including mine, we have legislation that says the FCC rules apply to municipal utilities. I guarantee you a one-off deal for one company that wants to go onto the polls would be found to be illegal under our state law. And even if it wasn't, we'd get sued in a second. So how do we get creative about doing the kinds of incentives that you discussed unless the company is willing to come in and indemnify the community from those kinds of litigation costs? And frankly, given our prior state law and creating municipal barriers and knowing where Google was on that, if we're in a state that has those kinds of restrictions, are we just kind of screwed because you're not going to come there anyway?
Well, first of all, I can't think of a situation where a private company, well, let me take one step back. First of all, we aren't asking for a one-off rule,
Right.
a one-off deal. We're asking for a change in public policy for any new entrant. So it's not about Google. We don't want it to be contractual where Google gets something. This only works and only makes sense is if it's a public policy applying to all. And when we're on the poll, we'll be subject to it too. So secondly, in terms of indemnification, I'm not aware of, and the lawyers internally have been talking about this a lot lately, of a situation where a private company indemnifies a community for enforcement of their own ordinance. You know, a city has to decide, is this good public policy, and is this what we want to be as a city to encourage broadband? And if so, pass your ordinance.
Yeah, I'll just tell you, it does happen, and it's happened frequently in my experience in the cable world where you have a second entrant into the cable market, and the new entrant doesn't have to comply with the same terms as the incumbent. At least in my experience, it has not been too difficult to get that entity that wants to come in and compete and say, if you guys get sued because you're trying to make this a competitive environment for us, we'll be there with you to support you and back you up so that your agreement that you're supporting is not going to cost you any money to defend in court.
I think the distinction I'm trying to make, and I'm not sure what your experience is, obviously, is between an agreement, like a franchise agreement, and an ordinance, which is public policy. Okay.
A little bit of both. So we're not really talking about broadband and economic development. We're talking about broadband pole attachments.
But you know what? To be totally honest, broadband economic development doesn't happen unless you figure out some things like the pole attachments.
Who would ever think poles
Who would
were
have thought that would be the sexy issue?
much more exciting than fiber? knows
Yeah.
that.
Hi, I'm Stanley Shore, Assistant Commissioner for the City of New York, and you brought up microtrenching, and we instituted microtrenching about 3 years ago at the great encouragement of Verizon, and in the 3 years since we've instituted it, we haven't had a huge amount of use of it. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more and whether if Google has used it at all in other cities. Verizon has used it. A couple of the high cap franchisees have used it, but I don't think it was been more than 100 sites that have used the microtrenching, and if maybe you could talk about the differences with the cost. I know Google Fiber has gotten involved with our Link NYC project, and that project has not used microtrenching even though it's available. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about why you think that it would help other cities.
Any type of digging in New York City has to be as complex as any place in the country. So we are using microtrenching in Atlanta. We're using it in Kansas City. We're using it in Salt Lake City. It's early days. Our whole endeavor, even though it feels like it's been around forever, we're still in very much early days. So we are using it. We're trying to figure out how much it saves us. We think it's going to be a really helpful technology. And in terms of the Link project in New York, we're helping on some of the back end, but we aren't involved in the construction. So we aren't. I don't know what they're using in that project.
Do you know any other communities who have used microtrenching?
I do not personally. I mean, and by saying I do not doesn't mean they aren't. Verizon's been talking about it for 3 years. I basically know what Google's been doing. So,
Just to add to that, it's not just a technique that's used urban. It can be used in mountainous areas and areas that's difficult to trench or bore. So it's not just an urban technique. It is used in other circumstances as well.
Other questions? Not one? All right. You sure? This is your last chance? Okay, well, round of applause for our speakers then. Thank you all so much.
I love listening to you guys all read those preemptions days. Where I grew up, stayed.